you. We're
Good to be
going.
back.
Thanks, John. We're going to go over a few ideas from Deleuze and Heidegger and maybe Jung, also in light of your upcoming course on the philosophy of the machine. And as I keep saying, this is a course for everyone who wants to learn how to defend your humanity in this weird and strange age. But if you're firmly confirmed that the human being is obsolete, you're welcome too, as long as you're not completely insane at the course. And we'd like to hear from you as well. So enrollment for that before Sean starts teaching us a few things about Deleuze and the Society of Control and other things. Enrollment is open now. The link is in the description. If you know anyone who's interested in the philosophy of technology, share the link of that video with them, please. We're reading Heidegger, Deleuze, Oswald Spengler, Edmund Husserl, Luhmann, and Friedrich Engels. I think that's about everyone.
Jung, did you mention Jung?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I didn't, but I think I did. Anyways, so Jung also, if I forgot. So let's start on Deleuze. And if you have any questions for Sean, we'll be here for about 30 minutes. Let him know, and I'll read out the questions at the end.
All right. So I'd like to start with a bigger picture. So there's something you talk about a lot on your channel as well, Johannes, and that is the collapse of metaphysics. And I would say that is, philosophically speaking, but also scientifically speaking, a crucial aspect of, let's say, academic, intellectual, or history of thought, you could call it. And that is that we no longer separate between the thing and its representation. We no longer make this metaphysical separation where every sort of thing is just a signifier for some ideal thing. For example, if you are from a more idealistic metaphysics, or that, for example, everything is a mere representation that our mind constructed, or something like that. This kind of has come to an end with the end of metaphysics, but the end of metaphysics has not been fully understood. That is the problem. So ironically, you kind of need metaphysics to understand the end of metaphysics, but how are you going to do it once you've removed that ground you're standing on, right? And there was this idea that Auguste Comte put forward, and that was that there is different stages to the development of human thought, beginning with the mythical, transitioning into the metaphysical, and then coming into the final, most enlightened stage, which is the positivist. Now, we all know at this point that the positivist project more or less failed. So what I mean by that, I don't want to dismiss every positivist philosopher, but what I mean by that is that there is no such universal language which can account for every possible empirical claim, and thus leads to a sort of structure to prove or disprove every empirical claim. And so what we see is this sort of end of metaphysics without, let's say, philosophical structure replacing it. And Heidegger described it very interestingly in an interview when he was asked, what is metaphysics now? He replied with cybernetics. And this is interesting. And there's an essay which is not perfect, but it explains it well. And that is the Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, where she kind of explicitly shows what is meant by that like the word you're saying no longer represents some sort of ideal structure or class or something. The word itself is part of a cybernetic network. So you speak something and that results in a reaction in the person you're speaking with, and that is imminently happening. It is all flattened on a so-called plane of immanence. And Heidegger would refer to something like that, specifically the trajectory this is taking as the kind of machinations of Gestell, the you could say positioning, the enframement. There's different ways of translating it. None of it are very satisfactory, if I may say so. But what is happening is this sort of replacement of metaphysics by pure kind of functional connectivity. And you see that with a lot of aspects of human life nowadays. So even personal identity becomes something that is a configuration of sorts, a configuration that is entirely entirely malleable, entirely changeable, manipulable. It's entirely contingent, you could say. And what this leads to, the ultimate trajectory of this, has been described by Deleuze. And to give some context, it's been described in a quasi-artistic way. So it is important to see this duo, Deleuze and Guattari, when they wrote A Thousand Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus, that they kind of functioned as sort of philosophical artists in a way. They were writing a theory, but they were also painting a picture, you could say. And what they're doing is describing these planes of immanence, these plateaus. And you could say they speak via the language of Gestell. So the complete cybernetization, the complete technization of reality, of metaphysics, is represented in the picture they paint. And that is the idea of the human as a multiplicity, no longer a unity, no longer an individual, but a schizophrenized, individual multiplicity of desiring machines. So the network of machines, what represents capitalism, the network of machines is that which is connected to the multitude of desiring machines that represent the human. And the human being thus no longer is any sort of unity, but it is consistently deterritorialized. And that is the process of capitalism. The process of capitalism deterritorializes and then reterritorializes, only to then deterritorialize again. But it is not a balance, it's not an oscillation, because the ultimate trajectory, and Guattari and Deleuze say it explicitly, the ultimate trajectory is deterritorialization. So every reterritorialization, you got to imagine it as just a deconstruction or a dissociation and a reconfiguration, is less coherent and less unified as the original one. So thus deterritorializes in even smaller entities and even smaller molecules. So for example, and I'd like to say that in a neutral manner without critiquing the specifics of it, but if you look at gender identities, you had an original identity that was constructed of a binary, male and female identity, that was then deconstructed, only to be reconstructed in a multiplicity.
It's already I think pernicious by the deconstructors to say that it was constructed. So that's the first, but that's just my view. So you don't have to.
Yes. Of course. But it's kind of reconstructed into a multiplicity, and that was kind of anticipated by Deleuze. Deleuze speaks of n genders, not 2, not 1, not 50. He speaks of n genders, and n, in terms, it's seen technically, because if you have a gendered structure in technology, it is all based on the connections. It's complementary connections in machines, and because the desiring machines are progressively deterritorialized, so that it produces more connections and dissociations, the amount of genders is n, which is a natural number that you keep adding one to. And each, the reconstruction of genders after the binary was deconstructed resulted in genders that were less stable and less coherent than the original ones, and thus only faster to be deconstructed. That is like a concrete example if you take some sort of cultural identity now, but they apply it to many different areas. And the idea here is that the trajectory, this which I identify personally with the greatest danger within techniques in Heidegger, for me, this is identical to what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as the body without organs. So the body without organs are pure intensities. There's no longer compositionality. It is pure intensities. It is the convergence point if you extrapolate the current trajectory of deterritorialization to its extreme. And you could see a lot of similarities with the so-called techno-capital singularity, which is an identity that Nick Land made. He used a Deleuzian, which identified the body without organs with the techno-capital singularity of technics, right?
Yeah.
And there you get that idea where you have sort of metaphysics, you have a sort of, I would call it a zombie metaphysics. So what you have is metaphysics has died, and it's like an art project that takes the limbs of the dead metaphysics and puts them together into sort of a Frankenstein metaphysic, right? And you have this sort of this monstrous picture you get painted there, because a multiplicity of desiring machines that are deterritorialized into a body without organs is nothing anyone would kind of find any hope in or anything to strive for, right? And that's not a coincidence that what I consider Nick Land to be the logical conclusion of that school of thought. The logical conclusion of postmodern leftism is this sort of abolition of the human. Nick Land is the most honest in the way that he's openly anti-human and post-human. Right.
Ray Kurzweil, just briefly, also goes in that direction in one of his weird books, where he speaks of the cloud and the interchangeability of the appearance of your body once your so-called self, has been copied into the cloud, and that you will be able to choose your bodily appearance at will, and you will be able to choose the outer appearance of your sexual partner in the cloud as well, and so will your partner be. To put it mildly, what Kurzweil here describes, whether he knows it or not, is a vision of hell. And so, but to me, just to be frank, because who cares? To me, it's always just so striking how the left is just doing the bidding of grand capital with a C, whatever they really mean by it. And I think that that's ultimately inbuilt in Marx himself, who never was against capital, but always in favor of it, saw it as absolutely necessary. But that's just my view. Who cares? By the way, before you continue, because we won't be here that long today, everyone who's here now, you're most cordially invited to join us in precisely, actually, in exactly 1 week. That's when we begin the seminars. Let me just say this, so you can enroll via this link. I put this in the chat. It's also in the description of the video. And so there are 6 seminars, 5 lectures. This is the page that it takes you to when you follow the link. If you know anyone, let them know about the course. We're reading Husserl, Heidegger, Spengler, Gilles Deleuze. Oh, I forgot an L. Sorry. Friedrich Engels, and a few others. And as good old Heidegger said, what we're discussing right now, the human being is the toy of technology. Technology threatens the human being in his essence. If you don't have time for the seminars, then you can just choose to, take the self-study option. 8 videos by Sean. Sean is not just a philosopher, as if that weren't enough. He's also an actual hardcore scientist, an astrophysicist, and a neuroengineer. So it's very difficult to argue with him, let's say. Then the group seminars, 6 seminars. Sean leads them. I will be there as a participant. I'll listen. I think there's only one that I won't be able to make because I'll be at a conference. But all the others I will be able to make, I think. At the final seminar, you'll be able to present your own talk. So if you want to air your utmost support of the machine taking over and abolishing the human being, then you're welcome to do so within the realms of basic decency. We will publish, if you want, anyone who wants to get published, we publish those talks on my channel. So if you want to get published and maybe get the word out on your own work, that's a good way of doing it. Or if you really want to, so as I just said, Sean is a scientist. Also, if you want to work with him more directly because you're working on a project, let's say a book project, or maybe even a scientific project in that regard, you get here 6 hours of private tutorials in the third tier, the philosophical dialogue tier. Enrollment is open now, so do join us. And if you have any questions specifically on the course, or specifically for Sean right now, then ask now in the chat and we'll get to them in about 10 minutes. Sean.
All right. So where was I at? I was, we were speaking of the kind of logical conclusion of Deleuzian thought. And in a way, Nick Land is an interesting scholar of Deleuze because he kind of is, let's say, honest about its implications, kind of has thought it to its conclusion. And that's where you end up in. You end up in this kind of, anti-human, post-human, whatever you want to call it, trajectory, which, he claims himself, nothing human makes it out of the near future. That's a Nick Land quote. And they say it openly, including like Deleuze himself, and as well as people like Baudrillard. They say openly that this sort of critique of capitalism is in itself part of the dynamic of capitalism. So in a way, Nick Land claims that even from Marx, the theory and critique itself are part of the mode of production. The mode of production needs to constantly critique itself in order to accelerate, liberate itself from its, let's say, archaic restraints.
Yeah.
And did you want to say?
Do you want to add a bit more? Should we just, that's basically it on Deleuze. Do you want to add a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much, well, I mean, that's pretty much it.
Good. So, because, at some point, what really should be, so when Nick Land, the few things that he writes or when he speaks publicly, whenever he's sort of challenged on this perfect immanence of capital, etc., there's always just the cop out to the horror and the impossibility of outsideness, etc. And so it's very much played up, and the language itself is highly suggestive. I think Noumena is his book title. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, this is where Heidegger comes in. Gestell is not perfectly immanent. Gestell is not exclusive. Gestell is not absolute. And even Baudrillard has to admit that at the moment of where the matrix absolutizes itself, it begins to collapse. By the way, here's a quote from Heidegger. The step back into the dwelling ground of the human being demands something other than stepping away into the realm of machines. And he also says that returning to where we already are, at least to some degree, still are, which means the human realm, is still possible. But if we do not, then we step forward into the realm of machines, then we will never be there. We will never be human, except as technical or technological monstrosities adapted to the machine. And he says this very importantly. He says this in an essay on the essence of language, where he elaborates on a poem by Stefan George, which is Das Wort, the word. I'll leave it at that for now. I'll just say this. So we will discuss this in the course more. Why these assumptions about perfect immanence fall short, and how, for example, through Heidegger and a few others, there is very much. Because, very often what you will also notice around the discussions of AI, watch out for false dialectics that are just made up. This is the only decision that we have. Really? Why does it have to be binary? Why does it have to be just this or that? Either this monstrosity or that monstrosity. So false dialectics are in play here, obviously. And you can say that Land is honest, but I think he would be more honest if he just quit. There's no need to be. Why do you even just write? Why are you still alive? Like, why continue? To me, that ultimately it all just boils down to a sinister performance, and ultimately also really bad metaphysics, to be quite frank with you. But more profound sense, what is striking with someone like Deleuze and others, and especially the French writers, is that the language is just at its utmost. It cannot. It seems, because it's so Latin, so owes so much to the Latin, that there is a certain incapacity perhaps of the language to also leap beyond or go beyond or think beyond. Hence you have, especially in the French, right, hyperreal, post, I think all the post and hyper, etc. All of this comes out of French theory, which to me always indicates that here the imagination or representation, Vorstellung, is not, it just leaps to another realm that it then imagines, or another plane, which is also one of these terms, instead of trying to articulate in a language that is appropriate for our time, not ways out, but ways of overturning from within. So I'll leave it at that. We'll talk more at the course. Enrollment is open. Sean, you may continue.
Yeah, well, there's this, I tried to say it with the most reverence and respect, but there is this, when you said that the logical conclusion or most honesty would be for him to stop, that is kind of the fate of the so-called cybernetic culture research unit at Warwick. There was the famous representatives there are Nick Land and Mark Fisher, both being kind of at this, at this climax of leftist thought, of theory, basically, of social theory, at this climax of social theory, and what ended up in is that it just ended. It just ended without much of a conclusion. It ended in capitalist realism. It's that book basically.
Well, the future never comes, right?
Yeah, well, in capitalist realism, there is hints of a kind of way out, but it's just kind of a weak critique of bureaucracy and stuff. Whilst the book itself is good, but it's almost resignating, it's almost giving, and same
what else would it be? Sorry, it's just so obvious.
Yeah.
Sorry, but communist critiques end either in suicide or visions of dystopia. And they can also, that's basically all they can do. And this is how Mark Fisher, may he rest in peace, he took his life.
Yeah.
And by the way, he ends his book, Capitalist Realism, however, with the following sentence: from a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. But it's ultimately always in those, capitalist realism, it's about how can we reconfigure the bureaucratic state so that it's less dehumanizing? How can we re-envision socialism for the 21st century so that it's less bureaucratic and less dehumanizing, or maybe even more dehumanizing in some respect, right?
Yeah.
But go on.
Nick Land.
When Sean and I may not agree on everything, right? This is something that you always have to say to people.
Yeah.
But anyways, go on, Sean.
Yeah, Nick Land ended up, moving to China and taking some like neo-reactionary turn, kind of like a weird kind of cut that kind of puts a lot of things he wrote before that into question. But nevertheless, the idea here is that we have this inevitable, well, not inevitable, but like we have this trajectory of techniques that seems to be plunging into some form of annihilation of meaning, annihilation of concepts at an ever accelerating pace, which is an accurate observation, I would say, that these gentlemen made. The idea here is, though, this famous quote of Nietzsche, if you stare long enough into the abyss begins staring into you. The idea is here, though, that like I described Deleuze to be a sort of using a Frankenstein metaphysic. What is happening here is that the abyss itself is fetishized.
Yeah.
The abyss itself is turned into a pseudo metaphysic, and the idea is in Heidegger, I would say, is different. I'd say that's a crucial difference, and I did, there was something that drew me to Heidegger because of that, and the idea is there that from this negation that you're seeing via techniques, from this negation, you rediscover what was once lost. It shows itself by itself only once you've been confronted with its negation. And this sounds maybe a bit abstract, and I think this is probably a good point to bring in kind of Jungian thought to an extent, because you can compare it to Jung's studies of shamanic initiation. I don't want to make it sound too psychedelic now, but the thought there is, and especially was further explored by one of Jung's students, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah.
The idea there is that the journey itself of the hero, for example, is one of descent into the underworld, a descent into an abyss in which everything seems to be lost, where then the world is rediscovered.
You see, so sorry, briefly. So this insane assumption that we can have full-on materialistic securitization and no loss will ever occur again. That's what leads to this complete blindness to loss, lack, deficiency. Sorry, that's the wrong word. Just loss, lack, withdrawal, non-availability, concealment. And that is, I think, where you're going with this, right?
Yes.
So very briefly, sorry. There's a just a second. So Mike is here. Hi, Mike. I hope you can make it. Susan is here. Susan, I hope you can make it too. I know that Dawson will make it, and he's here. Good morning. No, good afternoon, I guess, where you are, Dawson. I don't know Susan Murphy yet, but I hope maybe I've seen you commenting, so I hope that maybe you can make it to the course. I'll say this again to anyone who's just joined, because there's now 20 people here and there were only 10 before. We start in exactly 7 days. If you want to join us for the seminars, you can enroll here. And as you can hear, Sean is not just well versed in the science of it, but also in the mythos and the philosophy. Yeah. Okay, go on.
Yeah, so the reason I like to bring in Jung as well is because I think I would see him as a proto-phenomenologist. I would say that he was like, he kind of, a friend of mine described it as he ran forward into a territory that was yet to be explored by Heidegger and the likes, right? He leapt forward because his way of analysis is fundamentally phenomenological, but he himself always admitted to his ignorance of philosophy and always kind of he would explain certain things here and there using some Kant, using some Schopenhauer, using some Hegel. He was definitely well read on these topics, but he still claimed to not be a philosopher. And but you saw the way he would engage with a lot of texts and topics was inherently phenomenological, I would argue. And in this sense, it is interesting to look at this this description of where rediscovery happens when you get confronted with negation. So the whole interpretation of stories, you get the most intense stories if you're at a point where everything seems to be lost. That's the most gripping story, where everything seems lost and then gets rediscovered. And then once the world is rediscovered, it changes not only the world in that moment, it brings the ecstasies of time together. Even the world how it had been has changed, right? So even how the world had been until now is now rediscovered in a different light after it has been salvaged when everything was seemed to have been lost. And that is a fundamental kind of vision and truth that he could kind of see and extract from stories, from myths, from legends, right?
Yeah.
And that is something I would argue is very real in the current age. I think this is this irony we speak about, that like, especially in the age where metaphysics is dead, especially in the age where myth seems to be dead, where religion seems to be flattened in a way, we are all engaged in a very, you could say, intense and very passionate ritual. It's like everyone is engaged in this machine. There's no one activity I can think of that everyone is so consistently and at the same time like religiously engaged in, and that is this information extraction. That is this self-sacrificing, your body yet with organs to this machinery, right? And that in a way is at the same time an extreme level of like a quasi techno-religious ritual, I would argue. And that this encounter with nothingness that we have here, this encounter with the void, in a sense, can be like salvaged as a kind of, shamanistic encounter with the negation. This, like Jung would describe it in a story, that it's the encounter with the shadow, that like every world, every protagonist kind of has to encounter his shadow to become a more integrated whole, right? And that is, I think, that is the shadow. The shadow is kind of creeping up on us, and it is this which we kind of have denied, which we have repressed, kind of, and it's leading to something that is, ironically, very, religious and biblical in proportion. I'm purposely but also carefully using these terms, right?
I think though that probably myth will be much stronger than the Bible. That's just my suspicion.
What do you mean?
Well, no, I won't discuss this here. But I just wanted to say this again. Anyone who's here now, if you have a question, okay, Dawson has a question. We'll get to this in a second. And I'll say this now. Next week, in 1 week, we're starting always 6 to 8 p.m. UK time, which is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 3 p.m. Sean leads the seminars. Seminar dates are May the 14th, 21st, 28th, June the 4th, 11th, and the 18th. This seminar is the pro seminar. That's where you present your own talk, poem, maybe a video or so. If you want to get it published on my channel here, we do that. We're reading Martin Heidegger. We're reading Edmund Husserl, Oswald Spengler, Gilles Deleuze, Friedrich Engels, and Jung. We are offering group seminars but also an option just to take self-study. We have a few enrolled in that as well. If you don't have time for the seminars, that's for you. And if you want to work with Sean directly, this is for you. This final, this is the highest tier here. If you get 6 private tutorials with Sean, but if the group seminars are usually what most people enroll in, because you get to meet the others and you get to discuss with Sean. There also will be enough time for group work. So, and yeah, I would invite you all to join us. And if you know anyone interested in technology from a philosophical stance, then this is the course for you. There won't be that many out there where you read Deleuze and Spengler, and Husserl and Engels, and Jung. And we end on myths. Maybe just very briefly, I show you what the course then looks like. Here we are. First, we begin on the science of the machine and the ideology of the machine, the technology of the machine, the system of the machine, and the myth of the machine. These are the 5 lectures. There are 3 additional videos in some of them in here. And so we're reading Spengler, who is part of the conservative revolution. We're reading Gilles Deleuze, who's, let's say, more on the left of all of this. And so it's a good potpourri of different thinkers that usually are not brought into dialogue in the confines of academia, which perhaps leads also to this sort of suffocating mood inside academia, and also the suffocating situation that academics find themselves in until they think that there is genuinely no way out, because they only ever read themselves and only ever talk to themselves and to others. That, but it's funnily enough, we always talk about the end of the human being. It's still the human being who's discussing all of this. And but anyways, so let's get to the questions. Enrollment is open. Enrollment is in the link to enroll is in the description of this video. So here, Susan, I hope you can make it through the course. Can there be a copy of the shadow?
I'm not exactly sure what is meant by that question.
Well, the shadow, a copy of the shadow that Jung describes, so that we could make I'll just interpret something into this, so that we could make a virtual digital copy of it, for example. Maybe that's what's meant. Who knows?
Well, I mean, in a limited fashion, you could simulate. You can make a simulacrum of the shadow. So I have thought about this, and that would be an interesting experiment to actually use these language models that we have right now, and that is to have it, input your text data, your browsing data, whatever, and then have a shadow be constructed, something that turns out to be everything you'd like to not be true about yourself, and everything that makes you furious or whatever, and have that be simulated. That would be potentially an interesting psychological experiment. That's what I can think of when looking at that.
Just a second. Dawson, shouldn't we all become polymaths in order to reclaim the past whilst being deep in the sea of technology and information?
Polymath depends on what kind of polymath. I would say it's probably handy to have some sort of down to earth skill from the past, to reclaim the past.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's I think Johannes, you definitely would agree with this. One thing that's really a sanity machine is playing guitar, playing music.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that brings you back into a sort of more, sane and healthy state of mind, state of spirit.
There will be a collaboration between Sean and John at some point. And we'll bring in Sebastian Ostrich as well. He's a very good guitar player too. So we've got it covered. Sean makes music. By the way, I have another friend who's also called Sean, but he's spelled Shaun. He's a painter. He lives somewhere out in the woods, I think in Montana. He's from California. He's a firefighter in summer, and then lives in the woods in Montana in winter. He wrote a book actually, Winter and Summer, which I published a few years ago. He's a bow hunter. So a painter, a bow hunter, a philosopher, and he eats what he hunts. So, do you want to add more to Dawson's question?
No, but I mean, I guess it's always good to be a polymath in the sense that there is a kind of a tendency, especially now, for specialization, and then people being incapable of thinking holistically about structures and systems, and that can become a problem. Like, you have, I think one interesting example is for example that like policy for a whole society is often advised by laboratory sciences that have only tested a lot of their hypotheses in a lab setting, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Let me. Susan, I hope you can make it to this one. This course. I mean, I'd be interested to know a text by Hegel where there's some crossover. Well, let's say this. Hegel's philosophy of history is, I would say, crucial, and also maybe to a certain degree the introduction of the aesthetics, and of course, obviously, the science of logic, because the science of logic is Hegel's attempt to provide a metaphysics grounded in a logic that is not formalistic and that can show you how categories come about without mere supposition or Setzen. It's keine Setzungslogik. It's not a logic of positing. It's not formal logic. However, there's of course another issue with Hegel. Hegel is the philosopher of immanence. So I would leave it at that. But yeah, so if you come, Susan, as you know, so one way of looking at religion, organized religion, Christianity, Islam, perhaps as the most significant ones here, is that they were bulwarks against walls, against against capital or technology, these processes that are taking apart the world. So that's one view that also I think Nick Land subscribes to. And I think that Nick Land will become Catholic at some point. There already hints at that from what he's been saying publicly. But he gets very irritated by that on Twitter.
I know a scholar of his who's already converted.
A student of his.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he's a student or is just kind of had some collaboration. I'm not sure.
I mean, if okay, that.
So what I could add to this as well is I think one thing that probably is interesting in the science of logic is this sort of seeing the arc from being to nothingness as one thought movement. As one thought movement in a sense. And I think that is something that can be mirrored. I'm not sure exactly what crossover Susan is referring to, but like, for example, to some of the things we were talking about, that you have a kind of, in Jung's thought, for example, is also that like the the ego, for example, is not something that exists for itself, but it is kind of for its negation in the persona and the shadow, right? It's kind of what you so an aspect you would kind of see in Heidegger as well, to some extent, is that it's not that these are not entities that are in that exist in for themselves, but that they are towards something else, towards their negation to some respect. And I see that mirrored, of course, in Dasein being, towards death. In the same sense, you have the ego, which is actually towards its shadow. Like the shadow will always catch up with it, whether you like it or not. So you can become, actualized. You can become authentic in the sense of you face the shadow, or you will not face it, and it will just catch up to you regardless, but in a detrimental way.
So here is another comment from Susan I'd just like to show. That's important. Also, of course, his understanding of the body and of the organism, a lot richer, obviously, than what Deleuze has to say on this. Again, when you read Deleuze, what we read is a language that is purely pictorial, quite imaginative, doesn't argue for anything very often, makes up, insane claims, uses images. So, if you think that's philosophy, that's fine. But to articulate actuality, Wirklichkeit, is a tremendously difficult task, which Hegel undertakes and which Heidegger undertakes, and Kant, of course, also. Deconstructing Wirklichkeit, taking it apart, that's a bit easier, especially when you use your own dialectics that you set up. But I'll leave it at that. So, Susan, I hope you can make it. Was maybe one final question. Which one do you want? One final one. Was Deleuze deliberately subversive, or the other one? What did Jung mean when he said sometimes you have to do something unforgivable just to go on living?
I would say the subversive question.
Okay, briefly before you do that, now that we've got a lot of people here, Sean is teaching a course on the philosophy of the machine, where we're reading Deleuze, Heidegger, Spengler, C.G. Jung, Husserl, whoever else I forgot, Engels. Enrollment is now open. We're meeting in exactly 7 days, at least when, if you enroll in the seminars. They begin May 14th, 6 weeks. So 6 seminars, always Sundays from 6 to 8 p.m. UK time, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that should be, should be easy for everyone to make it to that one. It's a bit earlier, of course, at the West Coast. That gives you enough time, though, still in the rest of your Sunday. So we've got one tier, though, if you can't make it time-wise to the seminars, self-study, that gives you access to 8 video lectures by Sean. You can download the PowerPoint presentation. There's also audio files available for that. And there's no limit to course access. You don't have to finish it within 6 weeks. You can just finish this in your own time, come back to it again and again. Group seminars, where you learn in a group of participants, peers. 6 group seminars that Sean leads. I'll be there for some of them, if not all of them. If you present a talk at the final seminar, then we can publish that on my YouTube channel if you want. Or if you have a project that you're working on, you really need more guidance from Sean, then get the 3rd tier. If you're working on a longer piece, etc., that would be for you. Okay, now back to the question. Link to enroll is in the description of this video and in the live chat here. Go on, Sean.
So yeah, the question was Deleuze deliberately subversive?
Yes, sir.
I would say yes, to the extent that a lot of the, let's say, postmodern movements in art were also deliberately subversive. Like art became something that was purposefully something that's considered trash, right? It was purposefully like in aesthetic for in respect to the old sense of what aesthetics meant, in order to be a sort of, you know, artistic revolt to the, you know, paradigm of modernity. So you can see it in the trends of the art movement, I think, depicted, and I think that's how you should think about postmodernism. I critique the view that it's a specific dogmatic thought movement, but it's like a general literary, philosophical, artistic, whatever kind of general term. And I think Deleuze fits into that kind of framework. Just the only question is whether that deliberate sabotage, you could say, leads anywhere.
The thing is, of course, you know, you have on the other side, you have people like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, who are modernists, who also, to a certain degree, you know, don't describe anything that's beautiful or so still than any. So the modernist art of Francis Bacon could also be named here, perhaps, because they didn't. Because of course we shouldn't shy away from the ugliness of modernity either, or just dream away and, you know, like some conservatives, like maybe Roger Scruton or so, do think, oh, you know, everything's fine. Let's just build beautiful houses again. So there is something peculiar about modernity, and it's not solved by, not that there's anything to solve, but it's not properly addressed just by dreaming away oneself into fantasy realm. So there is, so it's not just, I would say it's not just purely subversive, but they do get at something that is true or genuine about our time. Also Baudrillard. But I also think that perhaps, you know, whenever a new medium gets, it becomes, we also have to look at this perhaps in an intergenerational manner, which is what we never do anymore, which is also strange. TV and mass printing press is relative. So TV is of course very new. The internet is even newer. But perhaps it also just has to do with some of the writers born in the early 20th century, and you know, then having to deal with a medium that they will never fully understand, and we grow up with it. To us, it isn't as revolutionary or as outlandish or weird than it was before. So they look, you know, sometimes when you look at people who are now also quite old, and I mean, you know, anyone, don't trust, we used to say don't trust anyone over the age of 30, but maybe someone who was born before widespread TV or didn't, you know, or the internet, perhaps their view will also be very different. We can learn from that, but it's perhaps also to a certain degree limited to certain assumptions that are no longer our assumptions, and also that work with on theory, like Marshall McLuhan, for example, that is basically to some degree outdated, dare I say. Especially, you know, some theories are quickly outdated because they never ground in anything. As much as I like Baudrillard, and I think we can learn a lot from him, for example, to be suspicious of computer simulations and models and calculations that determine so-called reality for us. That's what we can learn from him. But as you know, Sean, Baudrillard never really ties this back, or doesn't succeed at really showing, bringing this out, how this ties to the biblical God, even though that's mentioned, or to metaphysics in general. So, and one of the problems, this is what Sean pointed out at the beginning, which was so on point, is that you cannot be post-metaphysical. In order to be that avant-garde, you actually have to understand metaphysics, and that very often is lacking. That is lacking in Deleuze, it's lacking in Derrida, it's certainly lacking in Baudrillard. And the way that Baudrillard understands Plato is a school book Plato. You know, it's Plato that you learn in the first grade, and so it never really goes deeper into any of these issues. And in fact, you know, the post-metaphysical, whatever that really is supposed to mean, if it's then it, and this is where Heidegger is much stronger, you actually have to be a metaphysician in order to understand metaphysics. So in some sense, metaphysics is already being revived through an attempt to be genuinely avant-garde, which none of them, I would say, even succeeded at being. And also what we can also see, though, is that the old attacks, the old sophistic attacks on the phenomena or on language, for example, as we find in Gorgias, in the Plato's dialogue Gorgias, they're repeated here. The attacks on language. Language is just a system of science. It can actually describe reality. That's also a consequence of Cratylus, of a misunderstood Heraclitianism. So none of this, I would say, is the medium, perhaps the media change, and what we can do change, but what doesn't really change, it seems to me, to put it very simply, is our response to some of these phenomena, if that makes sense.
That's why I would argue that, I think we disagree to some extent on this, is that thinkers like Marshall McLuhan and his predecessor Lewis Mumford, that they are, I would argue, intergenerational to an extent, because they can extrapolate the line from the printing press even up to AI. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, and I have to admit that I'm not well versed in either of them, but I would say then, if we look at, again, only at the tools and find genealogical trajectories from different inventions of different tools or machines, that's, to me, is also not good enough. But
yeah, I get that, but I mean,
yeah,
like, you can extrapolate even further back. That's why I like the philosophy of techniques, where you can kind of rehash history of thought from a new lens again. Where I personally see a big correlation, for example, between the rise of, or the internal structure of Platonism and the rise of the written word, for example, the technology of the written word, for example. The kind of, you could say, fetishization of the concept,
right,
in a way.
yeah.
That is one aspect. And in terms of the avant-garde, that's something I also critique our common friend, Hans-Georg Möller from Carefree Wandering, that for when I speak to him in private, that I feel like a lot of his claims or attempts to be non-metaphysical, whilst actually being kind of anti-metaphysical, and thus still being engaged in the dialectic. You know what I mean?
Yes. Well, in a superficial dialectic. So, very good. Yeah, that I agree with. So, okay, so here's someone. We're not gonna answer this now. Paul Gärtner asks, "Is Paul Virilio relevant here?" He may be. So what we encourage is that you sign up, which you can do via the link in the description of this video, and also here in the live chat. And any thinker who's not mentioned, you should bring to the table in the discussion. So you will have read things that we have not read, or that we aren't too familiar with. But then, we can learn from you, and everybody else can learn also, and you can test your own thoughts against what others have to say. Well, in the beginning was the deed, of course, as Mephistopheles said. So, as Thomas just pointed out, in the beginning was the word, but as we all know, thanks to Goethe, in the beginning was the deed. What are your thoughts on Julius Evola? Again, Mr. Valentino, you are cordially invited to join us and share with us at the seminars your thoughts on Evola, who wrote a book which I think maybe you're reading or are referring to here, Revolt Against the Modern World. Of course, you have here another issue. You have two words in here, revolt and against, that are deeply, deeply modern, right? So I would hope that many of you can make it, and we see you next week then. Sean, closing remarks?
Closing remark. I think I saw a question by Duke Valentino about where he can find me and my work. It's just,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
it should be beside my name, Deep Noetics. Just look up Deep Noetics on YouTube. There's a few videos where also Johannes and others are featured. So check it
Where's
out.
that question?
Was a bit further down.
Okay. Yeah. I want to share it. I didn't see that one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Funny you say further down, but I would say it's further up. But Johannes, where can I find your guest? Well, my guest name is Sean McFadden. Remember that name. I'd be interested in finding more about his ideas. So yes, I'll put this in the chat. This is Sean's channel. It's Deep Noetics. Sorry, that's where you can find him. And sorry, go on, Sean.
Yes, it is an Irish name. Yeah. So yeah, I'm pretty much said all that I wanted to say. I mean, one point just about the metaphysicals. I recently got awarded the Gödel Prize for a text I wrote on how I kind of basically characterize metaphysics, and
Excellent. Yeah.
you see a kind of polarity often established where one end of the pole is put in a hierarchical order. It's superordinated of the other pole. So, sorry. For example, you have the part and the whole. You've got the discrete and the continuous. You've got the being and becoming, and then you have one of these poles always put over the other. And the reaction I often see, the people who are critical of metaphysics, is instead of trying to actually engage in a Verwindung, in a turning out of this, is to just invert the poles. And that's what Deleuze did. He put the multiplicity over the unity instead of getting out of twisting out of the unity multiplicity dialectic altogether.
Good. So everyone is strongly advised to enroll, cordially invited. Do you have anything specifically to say to potential students, Sean?
You're very welcome. As we've already discussed, I do think it's kind of rare, the stuff we talk about. I have been to as many talks and centers and conferences that I could find that are public at universities on these topics. And I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that they are at best disappointing. You don't get a thorough, important analysis of what's going on. And that's something we can definitely provide here.
Thank you so much, Sean. Excellent. As everyone can hear, Sean is more than competent. So we look forward to learning from him and with you all when we see you next week. So thank you very much. Good night.